any preparation that helps them think flexibly and responsively in relation to things they haven't considered before, that's bound to be helpful. But that will manifest itself differently in relation to different disciplines, as you'd expect. But I don't know if it's useful to look at a couple of those in a bit more detail, maybe, and sort of talk about that. So, maybe pick one of the examples that we've already sort of touched on. So for a subject like English literature, just to take an arts and humanities example, as I think we've already said, at least one of the interviews will involve looking at a text or an extract from a longer text. And it will almost certainly be a text that the person's never seen before. And therefore, any preparation for the interview, any practice for the interview that involves the applicant fairly frequently, a few times maybe each week, looking at texts they've never seen before and trying to make sense of them and trying to interpret them and explain and justify their interpretation of it, that's all going to be good practice. And again, I wouldn't suggest picking one text like that, analyzing it, and then analyzing the same text again, and then the same, because again, that's how you become entrenched. Make it a different text every time so that you're always having to start from scratch every time. And then you'll have more confidence when you have to start from scratch in the interview itself.
Hello everyone, welcome to Cambridge from the Inside. We're here with returning guests. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I should stop making up other names, I think. Just to keep it, I should say that I'm Mark Twain or something, but I'm not. I'm Marcus Tomalin and I'm the Director of Admissions here at Trinity Hall.
Nice. You can say Marcus Aurelius next time.
I'll do that, yeah.
But you were named after Marcus Aurelius.
Yeah, I know.
It was like, it was unknowing about...
Well,
what was the story behind it?
I didn't know at the time because I had no input.
Yeah.
Never worse people to be named after.
Yeah. We're here to talk about interviews, about preparing for interviews. We've done a lot of podcasts on interviews, subject specific podcasts and general interviews advice. But this podcast is going to be about how to prepare for interviews, and there's actually a lot of things students can do to prepare for interviews. But just to start off with, for anyone who doesn't know, what are Cambridge interviews, and do all universities have interviews, and what should students expect in them?
Yeah, so the interviews are a fundamental part of the admissions process at Cambridge. It's also true of Oxford. Those two universities interview everyone who applies to them and whose applications are strong enough to reach the interview stage. So in other words, they don't only interview people for certain subjects, they interview people for all the subjects. At other universities, sometimes the interviews are just there for certain subjects. So medicine is one of the subjects where quite a few universities do interview people who apply. But at particular universities, there may be no interviews at all for the majority of the subjects. And so the admissions assessment is just based on the paperwork. There's all sorts of reasons why at Cambridge we believe that the interviews are important. Some of them we've discussed at greater length in other podcasts, but basically they recreate what in Cambridge we call supervisions, which is this sort of small group teaching framework that's fundamental to the teaching that we do. And so really the interviews try to recreate that type of teaching environment, which is why they're so important.
Nice. So for anyone who's watching, broadly speaking, are there differences between interviews in like a humanities subject compared to a science-based subject? And if so, what are those differences?
Yeah, it's a kind of, I think, an interesting answer to that one. From a kind of high level, I would say there's very little difference.
Okay. Yeah.
Because whether it's an arts and humanities subject or whether it's a science subject, what will be happening for the majority of the time during one of the interviews, and the interviews normally last for about 25 minutes or so, is that the applicant will be encountering ideas or theories or approaches or interpretations or whatever it may be that they haven't considered before, because that's what teaching involves.
Yeah.
If I'm allegedly teaching someone and I'm just talking about stuff that they already know backwards, I'm not teaching them anything. I might be helping them revise a little bit, but more likely I'm just boring them. So teaching involves progressing from what one knows already towards things that one doesn't really understand yet or hasn't really considered previously. So at a high level, the interviews are all the same, because that will happen regardless of whether it's an arts and humanities interview or whether it's a science interview. When you go down from that higher level to the sort of nitty gritty about what is actually discussed in the interviews, then sure, there's a lot of difference. In a maths interview, in a natural sciences physical interview, in an engineering interview, there'll be a fair amount of maths, there'll be a fair amount of physics, especially for engineering and natural sciences physical. And you wouldn't expect there to be a lot of maths being worked through in, say, an interview for history or say, an interview for music. So the sort of specific technicalities of the different courses that we offer do differ, but at that higher level, all the interviewees are being required to consider things they haven't considered previously, because that's what happens in an interview at Cambridge.
Nice. So am I right in thinking? So in general, an interview involves answering questions and someone asking you questions, and that will happen in a science-based subject or a humanities-based subject. But the methods of answering those questions might differ between the subjects.
Exactly. That's right. Just because, different subjects require different skills, different techniques, different types of knowledge. And so the interviews for a given subject are designed to explore those particular requirements for that subject. There are those sorts of differences, undoubtedly.
Nice. And because I guess would I imagine thinking that like a problem-based subject like maths, that would involve some writing down solutions rather than all of it being oral?
Yeah, absolutely. For a subject like maths, I guess you could do it just speaking. It's difficult.
Yeah.
So usually what happens for a maths interview is, if it's an in-person interview, usually it just involves a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, and the interviewers will present you with an equation and then require you to manipulate it in various ways, integrate it, differentiate it, whatever it may be. And then they'll observe what you're doing while you're working your way through it. If they think that you're going astray, they might help and guide you back towards something that's going to be a little bit more accurate and lead you towards the right answer. In maths, they usually are right answers, but it's not important just to obtain the right answer every time. You might show your workings and go through it, and you might make a small mistake. You might get the sign wrong, or you might just do something that's very slightly wrong. But still, it's clear that you're thinking about it in exactly the right way and that you're using exactly the right techniques to arrive at the answer. So even if your ultimate answer is a little bit off, so long as it's clear that you're thinking about it really, really well, it doesn't matter. So even in maths, it's not always just about getting the right answer. Although, of course, if you do get the right answer, that's no bad thing.
No, of course. It was interesting hearing what you said, because I think everything that you said could also apply, at least what it sounded like, also applied to like analysing a poem, but just wouldn't involve writing, I guess.
Absolutely, that's right. Yeah. So for a subject like English literature, in one of the interviews, you may well be given a short poem either just before the interview or possibly during it. And then, the question relating to it might start at least with, take as much time as you need to read this, and then just lead us through it in your own words, summarize in your own words what you think it's saying. And they just want to see how you cope with maybe difficult syntactic structures or difficult vocabulary items that maybe you haven't considered, maybe you haven't encountered them before, but can can you work out what they mean from the context? So again, it's very, very similar to the maths example that you're working your way through. If you're going astray, they'll give you some hints and clues to get you back on track. And they want to see how much help you need in order to make progress with something that you've never considered before.
Nice. And so coming back to preparing for interviews and how students can prepare for them, a lot of schools, or some schools, provide mock interviews for students. And I was wondering, do you think mock interviews are worth doing if your student doesn't have the opportunity to do mock interviews? Like, are they going to be disadvantaged?
Yeah, mock interviews, it's an interesting one. I mean, about sort of 10 or 15 years ago, when, as a director of admissions, I used to go out and speak to potential applicants in schools. I often used to give mock interviews. And many of us sort of stopped doing that, I would say about sort of 7 or 8 years ago, for various reasons. In that context, if I'm talking to a room of about 150 potential applicants who are all interested in different subjects, if I did a mock interview in, say, engineering or something like that, on the feedback forms that we get them to fill out, most of them said, "Oh, it wasn't relevant for me because I'm not applying for engineering." So with mock interviews, it's quite difficult to set them up so that they really are genuinely subject specific. So that's one of the problems with them. The other problem is that sometimes if people are given the opportunity to have mock interviews, and there are potentially benefits to doing that, there are also some negative consequences of doing it. So sometimes, when I talk to people who are in the process of applying, I mean, it becomes clear that they've maybe had multiple mock interviews because their school is able to provide something like that. It can sometimes mean that they go into their actual interviews almost over prepared. And by that, I mean that they sometimes come in with sort of pre-packaged material, things that they've decided, I'm going to say this at all costs, whatever they ask me. And that can lead to situations where the interviewers ask a particular question and the interviewee kind of answers a different question. And the interviewers will try and pull them back and say, well, that's interesting, but actually we were asking about this particular thing. And then the answer again is in the other direction. And I think that can be one of the consequences of over preparing through certainly sort of multiple mock interviews. So I think my personal view is that while for some people mock interviews might be helpful, many of the very best interviewees I've interviewed over quite a few decades now haven't had mock interviews at all. Some of the very best people I interview are sort of experiencing the interview in its entirety for the first time there and then. And it means that there's a directness to their responses. They don't come with prepackaged material. They just listen to the questions, they think about them carefully, and they try to answer them as best they can, which is what we're looking for. So sometimes less is more when it comes to that kind of preparation, I would say.
Yeah, nice. I guess so. The issue in those situations, I guess, is when someone, don't know if dogma is the right word, but they've prepared a lot, which is great, but they're attached to the answers they thought beforehand rather than answering the specific question in the moment.
And that just never goes down well with the interviewers because what they want is a sort of genuine attempt to respond to the question they've just asked. They don't want to hear your carefully thought about and pre-prepared answer to a completely different question that someone else asked you 2 weeks ago.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I heard something completely different, like an actor talking about acting, and they asked him, is it all prepared or do you do it authentically? And he was, and it's the same in interviews, he was very much in favor of doing a lot of preparation and preparing something over and over again. But in the moment, you kind of want to let go of all the prepared stuff and still be able to, I guess in an interview, answer specifically the question that's being asked. And I guess would I be right in thinking in a perfect world, you'd have done a lot of preparation and use that when it's relevant in an interview.
Yeah, and the preparation, I mean, this is probably something we can come to talk
Yeah.
about, you know, in a bit more detail, but the preparation is more around becoming used to encountering ideas and theories and approaches and interpretations that you haven't considered before, and becoming used to explaining what your response to them is. Now, a mock interview might give you an opportunity to do that, but there are lots of other ways of doing that as well, and some of which might keep that sort of dynamic responsiveness rather than allowing it to become sort of entrenched, because that's really the thing to avoid. You know, having your 5 fixed opinions about a certain topic, you know, and you're just going to get that across in the interview, whatever they ask you. That's when there's often a real disconnection between the questions that are being asked and the responses that are being given. And anyone who goes into an interview with a much greater willingness to be flexible in their thinking and responsive in their thinking, they stand a much better chance of doing well in the interviews on the whole.
Yeah, and the degree as a
and the degree as a whole, because again, the interviews aren't really the point. You know, doing the degree, doing the course is the point, and we're just looking at skills that are invaluable for the courses, and that kind of intellectual curiosity and flexibility and willingness to pause and reconsider and reflect and modify. That's what you need really to thrive and flourish as a student at Cambridge.
And am I right in thinking those are kind of the skills that students aspire to have when they're doing exams as well?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, you know, sure, like any exams, I mean, the Cambridge exams, you can prepare, you can question spot, you can try and identify, you know, topics and things that you'd like to focus on in the exam. But come the exam, you have to be ready to react kind of in the moment to the question that you've been asked. And even if it's a bit different to the one that you prepared, you can't just dump your prepared material. That normally leads to relatively low marks. You have to kind of make use of some of the stuff you prepared, bring in some other stuff you weren't intending to use, but which seems relevant, and then have the courage to put all of that together in response to this question that you just haven't considered before. Those are exactly the skills we're trying to glimpse in the interviews, even at that early stage.
Nice. No, it's just slowly daunting on me that we're doing a fairly unstructured podcast on trying to be authentic whilst also being relevant about interviews in an interview. So there's a lot.
I mean, you know, it's all sort of very self-reflexive.
I still feel like I feel seen as I'm speaking.
And quite right too.
On that note, moving on to different ways to kind of more healthier ways to prepare for interviews. What if mock interviews can be good and can lead to prepared answers? I mean, I had a mock interview, and my teacher, and she was great, but she did ask me, why do you want to apply to this college? As in the mock interview, and I don't think an interview would probably ever ask you that.
No, I mean, it'd be very, very unusual. And again, actually, that's a good point. I mean, you know, the quality of mock interviews sometimes depends on the quality of the person asking the questions. And if it's someone who's maybe had experience of doing Cambridge interviews, great. But I think, you know, in my experience, very few of the people who give the mock interviews have that. You know, if they end up asking you a load of questions that are just very, very different to the sort of questions you're likely to be asked in your actual interview, then what are you preparing for? You know, that's preparing for something else. And so it might give you confidence going in that's a little bit misplaced. So I think, you know, the people who give those mock interviews, I think they're often very well intentioned and they do it as well as they can. But maybe some of them are basing it on, I don't know, the things that they were asked about in their Cambridge interview in the early 80s. You know, things have changed a bit, you know, subjects have changed a bit. And so maybe they're not best placed to sort of give a mock interview with any great authority. And so this is one of the sort of concerns I have about mock interviews. I should say, I'm sure some people do it brilliantly and they really, you know, so I'm not in any way wishing to sort of be rude about that. But I just think it can be quite a variety, so it's a little bit kind of hit or miss, which is again why I think there are other ways of preparing that are probably more reliable that we can maybe talk about.
So you have prospective students. They want to perform well in their interviews. They want to authentically respond to questions that are being asked of them whilst remaining relevant, but also do well. What preparation could they do? What kind of things would help them prepare for the interview?
Well, to go back to what we were talking about earlier, it probably depends a little bit which subject they're applying for, because again, at this kind of high generic level, any preparation that helps them think flexibly and responsively in relation to things they haven't considered before, that's bound to be helpful. But that will manifest itself differently in relation to different disciplines, as you'd expect. But I don't know if it's useful to look at a couple of those in a bit more detail, maybe, and sort of talk about that. So, maybe pick one of the examples that we've already sort of touched on. So for a subject like English literature, just to take an arts and humanities example, as I think we've already said, at least one of the interviews will involve looking at a text or an extract from a longer text. And it will almost certainly be a text that the person's never seen before. And therefore, any preparation for the interview, any practice for the interview that involves the applicant fairly frequently, a few times maybe each week, looking at texts they've never seen before and trying to make sense of them and trying to interpret them and explain and justify their interpretation of it, that's all going to be good practice. And again, I wouldn't suggest picking one text like that, analyzing it, and then analyzing the same text again, and then the same, because again, that's how you become entrenched. Make it a different text every time so that you're always having to start from scratch every time. And then you'll have more confidence when you have to start from scratch in the interview itself. And the way it often works is that you're given the text in the interview or just before the interview starts, but you're not told who wrote it or when it was written. So you're not given a date and you're not given the name of the author. And again, so often, especially for a subject like English literature, people place a lot of emphasis on who wrote it and when it was written. If you see that it's by Jane Austen, you might think, oh, well, I've read Pride and Prejudice. So then you start making all sorts of assumptions about this other text that you're reading. Some of those assumptions might be good ones. Some of them might be terrible assumptions. Whereas if you don't know who wrote it, you don't know when it was written, all you've got is a sequence of words on the page. Usually some literature has images, but usually it'll be a sequence of words. So you have to justify everything by pointing to a particular word or a particular phrase or a particular sentence. So if you want to conclude that it's satirical, what is it about the words on the page that lead you to the conclusion that it's satirical? Is it the way this noun is being used? Is it the way this phrase is being used? Is it, something, what is it that you can point to in the text that leads you to reach that conclusion about it? And so any practice doing that on a semi-regular basis should put you in a good position in the interview, because you'll be encountering a text you haven't seen. That's all right. You've looked at lots of those over the weeks, possibly months before the interview, and you've got to explain and justify your interpretation of it. That's okay, because you've been practicing doing that for several weeks or for several months. So it's a way of trying to make sure you're not disconcerted in the interview, because I tend to think that people who do well in the interviews at Cambridge are the people who manage not to be disconcerted too much. They're willing to respond to the questions, even if the questions are a little bit unexpected. Expect the unexpected. That's the kind of tagline really for Cambridge interviews.
Nice. And I guess when you were saying, so say if they're presented with a text and they know the author and they know some kind of themes that attach to the author, am I right in thinking you don't want to attack before jumping the gun and assuming that will be the case with the question that would be relevant to the question that's that's asked by you from the interviewer, or that's in the text, to double check if that's also in the text, if that makes sense.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. That's right. Because, again, if you know the name of the author, you'll probably just assume that it's about X, Y, and Z, because maybe at school you've been told that this person always wrote about X, Y, and Z. Maybe they're not writing about any of those things in this text. I mean, a lot of writers write about a very wide and diverse range of topics, and sometimes their most famous works are about a particular thing, but they will have written lots of other things that weren't about those things. And so that's where the presuppositions can lead you astray. So you start forcing interpretations on it because you think, they must be there somewhere. Maybe they're not in this one, And again, a useful way of sort of concluding that type of task is after you've gone through and interpreted it and tried to determine the tone of the piece, and as I say, what's going on in terms of the language and the style of it, and if it's a piece of poetry, what's going on metrically, blah, 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 all of those things. The last thing you can try to do perhaps is say who wrote it and when it was written. So kind of flip it round. Now you've actually analysed it just based on what's on the page. When do you think it was written? Plus or minus, I don't know, 50 years. Like, do you think it's early 19th century, late 19th century? Do you think it's 16th century? And more importantly, why do you think that? What is it about the language that causes you to place it in that historical period? Or what is it about the theme that's being discussed in it that causes you to place it in that historical period? So those can be really useful ways of preparing for interviews that frequently use prompt material. That's what we tend to call it, prompt material of that kind.
Yeah, so building up from the prompt material and seeing how it lines up with your current knowledge base.
Right, exactly.
Nice. So with regards to preparing for interviews, and I guess this could apply to both science-based subjects or humanities subjects and everything in between. Would I be right in thinking preparing is great, but ideally you'd want to practice talking out, speaking through your answers and speaking through your thinking. Preparing alone does a lot of good, but if you can, whether it's a teacher or someone else who's applying for a similar subject, talking through your ideas, would that help with when the interview comes and you have to do something similar?
Absolutely. Yeah. And of course, again, as we've mentioned on the podcast, this is where it comes down to some extent to personality type and things like that. There are some people who are just much more at ease talking and sharing their ideas than other people. That's fine. Again, we're used to seeing the sort of full range of different types of human beings, when we're doing the interviews. But even if it comes naturally to you or not, you need to prepare sufficiently so that you're at least able to have a go at talking through your ideas and explaining them and justifying them to the interviewers. And again, some subjects that may be a little bit easier than others. So if you're applying for a subject like, so at Cambridge we have a course, HSPS, which is really a sort of, politics course and sort of things like that. People who apply for that, they often spend quite a lot of time talking about, say, political ideas, different theories about how politics can and should work. So they tend to be quite at ease, explaining why they believe something is important or why something else isn't. Whereas a subject like maths, it's quite unusual to spend a lot of time speaking out loud while you're doing maths. It's normally quite a quiet, if not a completely silent activity where you're sort of working through, and then you might ask your teacher a question if you haven't understood something, and that's fine. But a lot of the actual calculating is done kind of silently. But even for a subject like maths, it's important for people to be able to speak their workings aloud. I mean, yes, as we've said, they'll be writing it on a piece of paper, so the interviewers will be able to see it. But if someone chooses to apply a particular technique at a certain point, and if the interviewer says, "That's interesting. Why have you chosen to do that there?" it's important for the person to be able to explain why they're doing that. They can't just really sit there in silence. They need to say, well, I thought that would help me sort out this part so that I could then concentrate on the other part and make progress with the thing as a whole. So being able to explain what you're doing aloud to help the interviewers understand why you're adopting a certain stance or why you've made a certain decision in your sort of process or your reasoning, that's crucial. So anything that helps people practice doing that in advance of the interviews is probably going to give them more confidence in the interviews.
Because if you're explaining to a peer how you approach an answer, that's going to help you when you're doing the interview.
Exactly, because it'll be the same thing. You'll be explaining, what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Yeah, nice. And earlier you were saying how you wouldn't want to keep analyzing the same text, because that's when you get entrenched in a way of thinking. You want to keep looking at different texts. Would I be right in thinking if you're, let's say, going through a past paper with a group of friends or a group of people, you'd get different from other people's perspectives. You'll get different perspectives on the same question rather than just your own, and that would also help have a more comprehensive understanding of approaching a...
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, again, sometimes, say if it's a text-based exercise, we might read the text through and interpret it in a certain way, and it seems impossible for us that it could be read differently. But if you sit down with 5-6 other people and discuss it with them, you usually find that they've read certain details very, very differently, and that can lead to quite an illuminating discussion. The thing I would say is also, in those kind of situations, it's good to develop what you might think of as a degree of skepticism. So in those sort of group discussions, if you're able to kind of set that up and use it as a way of practicing for the interview, it's highly likely at least one of the people in the group will just be very convincing. Some human beings are just very, very convincing. They speak very confidently. Maybe they speak very fluently. And often we interpret that as a sign that they know what they're talking about. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. There are plenty of examples, let's say, in the public sphere of people who speak very confidently and very fluently, but don't actually know a great deal about the things they're discussing. So it's good to learn a degree of skepticism, both towards what other people are saying and also towards what you're saying yourself. Because sometimes one's initial response to a text or some sort of, whatever it may be, idea in psychology or politics or whatever, on reflection, it may prove to be more fragile than you originally thought. And again, what the interviewers are looking for are signs that someone has the confidence and the presence of mind to maybe question their own initial response. So you're given a text, you're asked to interpret it in some way, and so you give your interpretation. Then if you say, but hang on, I'm not actually completely happy with that because I think I'm mistaken in assuming this about the thing we're discussing, and I should probably assume this other thing, which changes, that kind of self-reflection and willingness to adapt and modify when it's appropriate to adapt and modify is usually a good sign that someone's actually thinking. Again, I think, as we've said in a previous podcast, the two most problematical responses are just sheer sort of bigotry, where someone just keeps asserting the same thing, even if the interviewers have revealed flaws in it. They just keep saying the same thing. That's a way of avoiding doing any proper thinking. And the other way of avoiding doing any proper thinking is the opposite, which is where you just give way all the time. And as soon as an interviewer says, oh, but isn't this a problem? You just say, yes, that's a problem. You're right. Oh, yes, you're right. That's a problem. Oh, yes, I was completely mistaken. In those two extreme cases, there isn't really any proper thinking going on. All the real thinking happens somewhere in the middle, where you might decide not to alter something about your initial response because for principled reasons you think it's correct, but then you are willing to adapt another part of it because on reflection you kind of agree that that is a weak spot. So that's the kind of scary part that involves real proper thinking. And that's what the interviewers are trying to do. They're trying to create an opportunity for some of that to occur. So any practice that enables someone to be used to being in that sort of twilight zone between bigotry and just complete sort of submission. Anything that places them in that position and makes them feel almost at ease in that difficult place, that's bound to help them in the interviews.
Yeah, because sometimes there might be an interviewer might ask a question, and there might be a fairly direct way to approach the answer, but sometimes they might ask a question and be quite open to different responses.
That's right.
And if you always assume that the interview knows what they want to hear, then you're not going to kind of approach it with an open mind or be skeptical.
That's right. I mean, the interviewers do sometimes play devil's advocate.
Yeah.
So they'll say something or suggest something knowing that it's not the case, but they're just interested to see whether the interviewee accepts it without critiquing it, or whether the interviewee says, no, but that doesn't make any sense because then it doesn't fit in with this other thing. So they don't do that, routinely all the time, but occasionally, there is, often a moment in an interview where it's entirely appropriate for an interviewer to do that, just because, again, they're trying to get a sense as to whether the person they're talking to is really thinking carefully about what's being discussed, or whether they're just agreeing with their interviewers all the time.
And it's even though it's called an interview, it is supposed to be a conversation where, and would I be right in thinking if the interviewee, the student, wanted to ask a question for clarification, that should be encouraged?
That's absolutely fine. Yeah, I mean, if an interviewer is asked a question and it's just not entirely clear what they've asked, and the interviewee just wants to make absolutely sure they've understood the question before they try and respond to it, that's absolutely fine. Asking questions for clarity and stuff is completely valid, completely worthwhile. Occasionally, again, just thinking of people who perhaps have been coached in preparation for their interview, and I've interviewed a few people like this over the years. Whenever they don't really know how to respond to a question, not because they haven't understood it, but because it's quite a subtle or testing question, they sometimes say, that's interesting. And then they say to the interviewers, what do you think? And it's almost like they've been trained to do that. If ever you feel uncertain, ask the interviewers what they think. That won't go anywhere. The interviewers will probably, what I'd normally say in that situation is, well, I'm more interested in what you think about it. So it just immediately gets flipped back. So those kind of questions, which are more just like, I don't know, almost like a kind of nervous reaction or something, that doesn't really go anywhere. But that's not asking for clarification or something legitimate. That's just avoiding answering.
Even though it's a question from the interviewee, I guess it's the motive that makes a difference. Because asking, what do you think? I'm not too sure what the motive there. I guess it's a reaction to feeling stressed, which is completely fair. Yeah. But asking a question for clarification shows skepticism. Shows a lot of good things that you may want to answer the question really well, but before committing to something, you want to make sure that you're hearing what you're writing, what you're hearing before communicating, and finding a balance between answering and thinking clearly within 25 minutes is tough, but is definitely doable. And I imagine you've seen a lot of students, interviewees who are able to do both things in an interview.
Yeah, exactly. And the other occasion people usually have to ask questions tends to come towards the end of the interview, where the interviewers might say something like, okay, we're pretty much at the end of the interview, but do you have any questions for us either about the college or about the course? And that really is just an invitation in case there's anything that's not clear from the web pages or something like that. What it isn't is an invitation to ask any and every weird and wonderful question that you've ever thought about. Many of those questions are completely worth thinking about, but that's not the time and the place for it. So, probably said before, but over the years, when I've got to that point and said, do you have any questions about the course or the college? I've been asked things like, what would happen if there's no gravity? I've been asked things like, yeah. I was in an engineering interview, and the person we were interviewing said, what would happen if there was no gravity? And I just looked at the clock, and there was about 1 minute left, and I just thought, I'm tired, and this isn't what this bit of the interview is for. But the person I was interviewing with, and I say this for engineering, the person I was interviewing with, who's just quicker and more intelligent than me, just leant forward and said, "We would all die." And I think it's brilliant, because from an engineering perspective, if everyone's dead, you don't need to build bridges, you don't need to do anything with concrete. It's game over, right? If it had been like a natural sciences physical interview, then it's the dumbest answer, because who cares? Like, whether human beings are around or not is irrelevant, right?
Yeah.
But it's a nice little distinction between those two subjects. I've also been asked things like, what's virtue? Again, you've got 30 seconds of the interview left, and someone says, "Yeah, I've got. Okay, what do you think virtue is?" It's like, I mean, this isn't what that particular part of the interview is about. I mean, that might be a question I might ask during an interview, and then we might have a useful conversation about it. But with 30 seconds to go, I've said, "Do you have any questions about the course or the college?"
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about virtue.
There's a difference between asking 30 seconds left, "What's virtue?" and saying, I've been really getting into normative ethics, and I really liked virtue ethics. Do you have any good recommendations?
That's fine. That's fine.
It's hard. It's hard when someone. It sounds like you don't want to assume, but it sounds like someone wanted to ask like a clever question.
Probably. And I think the only answer to it is, well, virtue is something that it requires more than 30 seconds to talk about. Exactly. That's almost the definition of virtue. So, yeah.
Yeah, my defense is that I was quite young, but in a previous job interview at the end, they asked me if I had any questions, and I asked them, how did the interview go?
Oh, wow. What did they say?
It
was going well until now.
They were really surprised, and they said, "Oh no, you can't. That's the one question you can't ask." In my feedback, they said that it went really well, but I didn't get the job. So there you
There's
go.
a time and a place.
There's a time
and a place.
And I think, but there, I mean, it's for your Cambridge interview, it's completely fine to not have any questions.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and these days the web pages and everything are so detailed, probably a bit too much information, that I think most people are pretty clear about things. But I think it's good, just in case there is something. It might be about, will this optional paper in the second year still be available, in the year that I'd be doing the course? That kind of thing. It's completely legitimate, but it's not a trick question. If someone just says, "No, I don't have any questions," they're not losing points. It's not part of the formal interview. It's just in case there's any information that the person feels they need that we can usefully supply, but about logistics to do with the course or the college or whatever it is.
No, yeah, exactly. and it's there for the students rather than like a continuation of the interview. We're actually asking to see if you actually have any any questions. So the one thing that's quite new in the past couple of years is AI and ChatGPT, and we probably should do a podcast on this at some point, but where ChatGPT and AI sits in education and learning, and teaching ourselves, teaching in general. Can ChatGPT be a useful tool for preparing for interviews?
I think from my perspective, the short answer to that is yes, so long as it's used kind of intelligently, in a kind of savvy way. I think, again, in previous podcasts, we've said things like, using ChatGPT to write your personal statement is kind of dopey, because you know far more about who you are and what you do and what your motivations are, for studying a subject than a bit of software does, even if it's a very powerful bit of software. So, using it for those parts of the admissions process, I mean, I'm sure people do. I just think it's really unwise. I think you do a better job doing that yourself. But for preparing for the interviews, I think it can potentially be very helpful, especially for people perhaps who are working in situations, studying in situations where I don't know, their teachers aren't necessarily able to really focus on them and help them prepare for their interviews. I mean, some schools, are fortunate, they're quite wealthy and they have, large numbers of staff, and other schools aren't so wealthy and often have staffing issues. And so in some cases, it can certainly feel as if the applicants are sort of having to prepare themselves for their interviews. And that's fine. I think you can do that very well. And for the reasons I said earlier, often the people who haven't received so much formal training for the interviews do far better in the interviews because they respond more directly and things like that. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, let's take a sort of, sciencey subject. Let's take a subject like maths. How can you use ChatGPT to sort of help you prepare for your maths interviews? Well, you can ask it to generate, 5 questions. You could say, at the sort of like first year university level. So again, a little bit beyond what you've been doing at school, but not crazy difficult. And you can work your way through them and try and figure out at least what you'd need to know in order to be able to answer those questions. I mean, you may be able to answer them immediately, but if not, you might think, okay, say if it's about calculus, just to take that as an example, you might think, okay, the stuff that I've done so far about how to integrate, how to differentiate equations, I don't see how I can apply that in this case. This seems to be more complex. Maybe it's some type of differential equation that people hadn't seen. That's fine. What you can do then is take that as a starting point for understanding in more detail what you would need to know in order to be able to cope with it. And then you can spend a little bit of time. It almost becomes like a super curricular activity, finding out a little bit more about that slight sort of extension of the maths that you've been doing. And of course, with something like ChatGPT, you can then subsequently ask it to generate solutions to the questions it's given you. Now, again, I said earlier about skepticism, don't just trust the answers that it gives you. They may be absolutely correct. They may not be absolutely correct. This is why these systems still hallucinate not infrequently. But even if it's incorrect, you should be able to convince yourself whether it's correct or not. Yeah. So again, the onus should be on you. It's about an active intellectual engagement with that particular question or that particular set of questions, rather than just passively accepting what ChatGPT outputs. And so if through using it you become more intellectually engaged, that's bound to be good preparation for the interviews, because for the reasons we've said earlier, what the interviewers are hoping not to see in the interviews is just real intellectual passivity, just real kind of a lack of willingness to think.
And just for anyone who doesn't know, can you explain what hallucination is in AI and ChatGPT?
Yeah, so basically, because of the way these systems currently work, there aren't inbuilt fact-checking strategies. So if you ask something like ChatGPT a question about almost any topic, these days it is able to search online, so it can search the web basically, and that can often lead it to responses that are more factually correct. But it's still possible, and it happens not infrequently, that the answers are just factually incorrect. If you ask it about to suggest, I don't know, publications about a particular topic, if it generates 10, maybe 8 of them will be actual books about that topic, and 2 of them might just be completely made up. They might be quite similar to actual ones, but the names of the authors might be a bit different and things like this. So it just makes errors. And it can do that whatever topic it's being asked about. And so you should always use its outputs with an appropriate degree of skepticism. And as soon as you just passively accept its outputs, you're in danger.
Yeah.
But as soon as you stop doing that and start engaging intellectually with its outputs and trying to convince yourself whether you think that that solution to this maths problem is correct or not, then you start engaging with it in precisely the same way that the interviewers want you to engage with their questions.
Yeah. I'm right in thinking, in general, kind of passively believing in, whether it's an interviewer or your peers or a text, passively believing in it without seeing if you actually believe in it or being critical of it can be an issue of in itself. But with ChatGPT, I'm right in understanding that ChatGPT is basically a guesser. It guesses, like its answers is a guess, and you wouldn't, if you're asking someone a question and they gave you a guess, you wouldn't believe them wholeheartedly. So you shouldn't believe ChatGPT in the same way.
I mean, it is kind of a guess. I mean, basically, these systems work by associating. I mean, it converts everything into numbers. So even if it's trained on text, let's say English language text, it converts the words into unique numbers. So what it's really doing is learning how sequences of numbers relate to other sequences of numbers. And they may be words in English, they may be words in French, they may be mathematical symbols. It doesn't matter what they are. So, if it sees that, I don't know, picking these numbers at random, if it sees that, the number 12 is often used in relation to the number 264, and that those things often go together, it will learn that association. And therefore, if asked about 12, it will output the other number. And when we sort of map that back to say, things in the English language, it may be that one of those numbers is Paris and one of those numbers is the Eiffel Tower. So it knows that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris simply because it knows that number is often mentioned when that other number's around. So those things really are closely associated. So if that counts as guessing, then it's kind of guessing, but it's recognizing those patterns, it's learning those patterns. And that's what enables it to produce outputs that are often, pretty convincing, but there is a lot of scope for it still to be flawed because, as I say, it's not as if it fact checks things every time before it generates the output. It's just learnt those patterns, and sometimes it learns the wrong patterns, or maybe you've asked it something that it hasn't seen a lot of training data on, so it's learnt fewer associations around that particular topic.
So another thing, so kind of going back to preparing for interviews and using ChatGPT, another thing that a lot of people are using ChatGPT for is to improve the understanding in a language they're learning, like in learning languages. And does ChatGPT have a place in preparing for MMO interviews or interviews when you're applying to study a language at Cambridge?
Yeah, again, I think used wisely, it can help. So the interviews will certainly involve some speaking in one of the languages. So obviously, it's usually a language someone has studied to usually A-level or equivalent standard. And there may also be an element of having to read a text in one of the foreign languages. And these are the sorts of things where, again, if used wisely, I think ChatGPT and the other big large language models can be useful. If you compare them to things like Google Translate, which people I think still use a bit, Google Translate, you'd put, say, the French in on one side and the English would come out the other. It would sometimes give you alternative translations that are just slightly different. And if you click on certain words, it would give you the kind of dictionary definition of what the word means. So you got some information, but the interface for Google Translate wasn't dialogue based. It was kind of a static, you put the input, it generated the output, and you couldn't then interrogate it about why it translated it in that way. With something like ChatGPT, it's very much a dialogue-based system. So you can input a text, ask it to translate it, and then ask it to explain why it translated a particular word in a particular way. And you can ask it, what are some of the other possible ways of translating that particular word? So again, used well, it causes people to become more intellectually engaged in this case with the act of translation, and some of the decisions that one makes around translating. Used badly, it makes the user more passive, because they just put in a text, get a translation, trust it implicitly that it's a perfect translation, whatever that means. So they haven't developed, they haven't learnt anything, they haven't entered that sort of zone that we were talking about, where you have to deliberate as to whether something has been well done or not, whether it's misleading or not, and you have to sort of convince yourself one way or another. So I think if it's used in that way, so that there's real engagement with the output and a real scrutiny of the output, I think it does have benefits.
So if I'm right, if I understand correctly, asking it to translate a text in English into another language and to leave it there can be quite passive, because you're not seeing how it's translated, but that you can use ChatGPT to explain how it's translated the text, and that exercise can help you understanding of the act of translating. Would it be useful? Are there any pitfalls to asking it to create a piece of text in the language that you're learning, and then reading that text and seeing how much you understand without translating it, and then translating it and comparing it to the English to see how much you understood? Is that a helpful exercise?
Absolutely, yeah. Because again, it's good to practice reading texts that you haven't read before.
Yeah.
Because again, if you just practice by having a look multiple times at the same text that you're already familiar with, it can make you feel all sort of warm and cozy and at ease. But that's probably not how you'll be feeling during at least part of one of the interviews. You will feel as if you're having to think. You will therefore feel a little bit apprehensive, perhaps, because you're not sure that what you're about to say, is this really insightful, or is this really not particularly relevant? You can often feel a bit uncertain, and so if you generate texts that you haven't seen before, read them through, and then maybe generate the translation to check your understanding. So long as you do that, so that you're constantly looking at different texts, so that you're constantly slightly disconcerted, that sort of thing can be good preparation, because it recreates the sorts of things that are likely to happen in the interview. And as we said earlier, even if you are doing that working with something like ChatGPT by yourself, it's still good to speak aloud and explain your translation or your analysis of a text. Because if you're just doing that silently in your head, you won't be able to do it silently in your head during the interview, because otherwise the interviewers won't know what you're thinking. So even if you're working one-to-one with ChatGPT or any of the others, still speak aloud, show your workings verbally, because that's an important part of the practice.
Yeah, and am I right in thinking reading text in another language helps you practice understanding those texts in their own language without translating?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, when you're learning languages, really at a fairly early stage, it's good to stop constantly translating. If you're learning, Italian or French or German or something, if every time you encounter a sentence in Italian, French or German, you have to translate it in your head into English in order to understand it, that's a step in the process you want to try and get rid of as soon as possible. You want to be understanding it in Italian or in French or in German without having to constantly silently in your head convert it into English in order to comprehend it.
So someone could slowly build from ChatGPT, where they read text in the language they're learning, and then once they've understood some of it, compare it to an English translation, which they can create in ChatGPT, and after they've gained a proficiency, then move on to books, where you can't just shove a book in ChatGPT to translate. So you can slowly build up to that.
Exactly.
To that stage. And you were mentioning about practicing the dialogue, which is something key and essential for the interview. Is there in ChatGPT, is there like a speak function where you can practice dialogue, or is it just purely typing in?
No,
a
you
question?
can. There's a little microphone
Okay.
button thing, and if you click that, you can speak into it. So again, especially with languages, it's good to practice the speaking, because as we've said, part of the interview will involve speaking in one of the languages, that the applicants have some expertise in. So anything that helps practice, speaking aloud is good. So if you're doing this sort of exercise where you've got ChatGPT to translate something, if you then want to sort of probe its decision-making process behind the translation that it's produced, you can do that by asking it questions in French or in German or in Spanish, or whichever language it is that you have real confidence in. And so there you're practicing the speaking element as well as the sort of probing the translation and reflecting upon the translation. So all of that is potentially very useful.
Nice. Before we go on to the next question, I think just noticed that it's been fairly humanities heavy in terms of the different resources you can use to help you prepare for interviews. But in terms of stuff that I did for my chemistry interview, and I think that's useful for sciences and maths, if you're applying for maths, going over step papers and going over step papers with anyone else who's applying, who's doing step as well, would be talking through those questions and answers. Could be really good preparation for a maths interview. I know lots of people who did that. There was the group of people in the maths class kind of made it was called Pie Club.
Hey.
It was great.
See what they did there.
I was there. It was great. Yeah, we had a great time. Just it was in the maths room, Pie Club in the maths room.
Did it involve like pie, edible pie?
Yeah,
there was
at
sometimes
lunch.
pie.
There was pie as well. It was great. And there was just whiteboards everywhere, so we were just doing maths, and it was so much more fun than something that you kind of assume would be a solitary exercise. Actually, a group of friends going over maths questions, and it's just so much more fun then. And practicing for the interviews, because you're kind of having to explain your mess.
Yeah.
and if you're saying,
what does that say?
And it means you have to kind of write out your work legibly, because you might not care what the teacher thinks, but you want your friends to understand what you've written. And your teachers and your interviewers,
everybody.
For the sciences and for maths, there's the Olympiads, and for chemistry specifically, there's the chemistry Olympiads and chemistry Cambridge Challenge paper. They were really good to practice, and especially go over talking through your answers with anyone that is also taking them, because they were good, because those Olympiad papers, they used A-level content. But had questions in unusual situations, which is kind of identical to the interview. And the only thing that kind of to make it very similar to the interview was just to talk through the answers of someone. And normally in those situations, it wasn't really about, when I do a paper, about getting the right answer. It was the more interesting times were when I didn't get the right answer, trying to understand what had gone wrong, and seeing what someone else had done, and both working together.
But that's the thing. I mean, it's particularly true for maths related stuff, but it's true for other things as well. That if you get the right answer, it's great. It confirms that you've understood something, but you haven't learnt anything. So if you don't get the right answer, despite having tried really seriously and intensely to get the right answer, but then you realize that it's wrong, that's a learning opportunity. And so then you've obviously got something wrong, but figuring out what's gone wrong and why it's gone wrong and what you were assuming that you shouldn't have been assuming, and all of that is how you improve. So in some ways, it's more beneficial to get stuff wrong. You learn more. The more stuff you get right, the fewer opportunities you have to learn stuff.
Yeah, no, exactly. Some people ask, I can kind of see why. They think that watching something like University Challenge and practicing University Challenge questions would be good preparation for an interview. Is that the case?
Well, like full disclosure, I taught the person who chairs University Challenge, so I can't say a bad word about it because in some ways I'm implicated. I guess.
What was his name again?
Amal Rajan. So
what was he studying?
He's studying English.
Okay.
But yeah, so I think, again, taking something like that as a starting point is potentially helpful. I mean, I think a lot of people watch it and they don't actually know the answers to sort of most of the questions, so they hear what the right answer is. But again, that might give you an introduction to a scientific theory or an author or whatever it may be, that you can then find out more about independently. Because again, watching a TV show like that, it can be a very intellectually passive thing to do if you approach it in that way, or it can be something that leads to much greater sort of intellectual engagement on your part. And again, the onus is on you. If you make it a passive experience, then I'm not sure there's a great deal of benefit. But if you avoid that and make it something that triggers you to reflect upon certain things more deeply and to find out more about them so that you really understand them, then it's potentially advantageous.
Yeah. But I guess the reason I asked the question is that I kind of see University Challenge as a test of knowledge. To what extent are Cambridge interviews a test of knowledge?
It's the sort of thing that a particular line of questioning might start with some kind of test of knowledge. So again, in use a maths example again, if it is some sort of line of questioning about, say, calculus, looks at calculating derivatives or whatever, it may well start just with something that's relatively straightforward, and the person's asked to calculate the first derivative, and it should be something that takes them all of 10 seconds to do.
But they should have learned their schoolwork.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's really just to confirm that they've understood the stuff they've been doing at school. They know how to apply the techniques. In this case, they know how to calculate derivatives, and that they can do that, accurately. So that's kind of a test of knowledge. That's never going to be the end point in a Cambridge interview. That's only ever going to be the starting point. And then from that particular kind of place, the questions will move the person beyond that towards things that are related to the things that they've studied and learned at school, but more advanced, slightly more advanced, to see how much help they need to make progress with it. So there are elements of testing knowledge, but it's certainly not the case that both interviews in their entirety will just be, what's the capital of Paris? Or what's the capital of France? I gave you the answer. What's the capital of France or whatever? It won't be just like either a general knowledge test or even a kind of specific knowledge test in its entirety. There will be elements of that, but it will go beyond it quite soon.
Yeah, and I think, and it's definitely true for the sciences. If you really wanted to prepare for the interview and you're thinking, I could show how I want to impress them by knowing how much, let's say, like university knowledge I know, so that you went over the first year content. But in an interview, you're not going to be asked about university level content. You're going to be asked about content that they're hoping that you would have covered in your.
That's right, and as I say, it'll be stuff that you've covered, and then you're pushed a little bit beyond that, but you're not expected to have a detailed knowledge of things that you'd study in the second year or the third year of the undergraduate course, because if you can already do that stuff well, at the point you apply, you probably shouldn't be applying for the course. You're overqualified for the course. Yeah,
it's about how you use what you know rather than just knowing everything. And the last question that we have here is, I guess it's kind of a summary of what we've been talking about being prepared, but also being authentic and answering in the moment. If students aren't supposed to have prepared answers, how can a student avoid making mistakes if they're kind of thinking on the spot?
They can't, and they shouldn't. I mean, for the reasons we've sort of mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, almost everyone in a Cambridge interview will make at least one mistake at some point. Most people will make more than one mistake. That's absolutely fine. The questions will be designed so that it's highly likely people will make mistakes, because as I said, it's only when people make mistakes that there's an opportunity to teach them. If they just give 100% perfect answers all the time, there's an opportunity to teach them anything. They kind of know it all. And in an interview situation, that just means that the interviewers have chosen their questions really badly. And of course, they have a lot of experience and a lot of training, so they won't do that. They'll pick questions that, they'll pick questions that it's possible to engage with, but they're not trivial and superficial, easy questions. They will be demanding questions, but not ones that are so difficult that there's just no chance of understanding them and producing sensible responses. And people will make statements in the interviews that they'll subsequently want to retract and say, well, actually, when I initially said this, that's too strong, that was too general, I needed to be more specific. So they'll constantly sort of revise what they've said and correct little sort of inconsistencies or correct assumptions that they've made. That's absolutely fine. That's what the interview should involve. So it's not about not making mistakes. It's all about how you choose to respond when you realize that you've said something that's either a mistake or it was badly expressed. What do you do next? That's really the sort of most important part of the interviews.
I think so. The last question, because I think I completely agree with what you're saying, but a lot of people are afraid of making mistakes, and they're anxious about their interviews because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing and making mistakes, and for it not to be like a perfect interview. Like, do you have any advice for an applicant who has an interview coming up and they're just afraid of making mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, the advice is really try and be less afraid of it. Try and make better mistakes.
Okay.
Because some mistakes are just, due to people not thinking carefully enough and just kind of being flippant and superficial, right at the start. Try to avoid those things, so that there are some really brilliant mistakes and there are some really less brilliant mistakes. Try and make the best mistakes. Try and make mistakes that are really fascinating and kind of impressive. And that will lead to interesting subsequent discussions that will enable you to maybe understand something more deeply. Sort of embrace the making of mistakes. I think it's just part of the way people are taught. You're quite right. They're often just terrified of making mistakes. But as we've said multiple times, without making mistakes, you're just never going to make any progress. You're never going to learn anything. And coming to any university, particularly Cambridge, it's all about learning stuff and it's about making progress. To do that, you have to try and lose your fear of making mistakes.
Because I guess once you've gotten past that, losing the fear of making mistakes, there's a whole world of opportunity to learn and grow in the interview and afterwards.
Completely. Everything becomes so much more enjoyable. Because you've just got rid of that paralyzing fear. You've liberated yourself so that you're able to sort of make mistakes. And then, as I say, the task is to try and just make better mistakes so that you stop making kind of stupid mistakes. Make really good, insightful mistakes. Mistakes that are so good they really cause you to reflect upon definitions in a huge amount of detail and stuff like that. And that's when the whole process of learning becomes really enjoyable. Really, really just fascinating and compelling. But you have to get beyond the fear of getting stuff wrong in order to reach that kind of that sort of zone.
Because sometimes you'll get something that's like really right that you wouldn't have tried if you let your fear stop you from trying.
Exactly. Yeah.
Nice. Well, thank you, Marcus, for a really interesting podcast on what I thought was about preparing interviews, but really for me it was just about preparing podcasts the whole time.
That's right, just life advice. Stop being so afraid.
I just kept thinking about how I don't prepare for any of these podcasts. We just more or less wing it with a rough sketch of notes that I made in my notes app, and we're here to talk about how that's a good thing.
Exactly. So you feel validated. No?
Yeah.
Good.
Well, I guess we'll I think we also talked about being peer reviewed.
That's also true. That's also true. So let's see what they say in the comments.
Yeah. Yeah, if this video does badly, then we might have to reevaluate things. But no, and if you're watching, we have done loads of podcasts on interviews advice, and on our YouTube we've done different playlists, and one of them is all of the podcasts we've done on interviews, and there's subject specific interviews advice. There's one podcast we did on interviews top tips, where we talk about top tips for the interviews, but in a quite a brief way. It's only around 20-25 minutes long. But yeah, if you have any other suggestions for videos that you want us to do, let us know in the comments, and we'll see you guys next time.